Evan, I mean, where do we even start if you're trying to compare countries?
Well, I think you should start with economics, and I think you should start with economic might. We always think per capita is the best way of measuring how successful economy you are. The GDP, not the most useful measure, but it's the best measure we probably have. And we find America, and I think we'll find in all sorts of areas, this accords with the kind of cliches, America is richer than Europe. And I did, colleagues have been burrowing away looking at statistics. I took a very simple guide, which was an average of Italy, France, Germany, UK as a sort of representative slice of the big nations of Europe versus the US. And the US is a good third richer than the average of those four countries. Per head, they are 30% richer. However, and this is I think, the most important point, some of that, in fact, quite a lot of that, is down to the fact that Europeans don't work as hard. They have shorter working weeks, they have fewer people employed, they have potentially lower retirement ages, and longer holidays than the US. So some of that, I think you would say, is choice. And if you look at not the annual income of people, where the Americans are clearly much richer, but you look at the hourly output per worker, you find that America is more productive. Yes, it is way ahead of the Europeans. But that 30%, 35% comes down to more like 15%. So the Americans are more productive, but they're richer by more than they're more productive because they just work a lot more. And I guess the crucial point when it comes to economics is these are choices that nations are entitled to make. You might say, let's be a little bit lower income, but have longer holidays. I mean, that is a perfectly legitimate choice. That is the choice Europe has taken, and relative to the US. And that explains part of why the Americans are so much darn richer than the Europeans.
OK, but just to be clear, there is no reason why, given size, because a lot of people just think, look, it's a very large nation with a very big population. Of course they're going to be bigger. When you take Europe, it could compete economically?
Well, I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Because obviously Europe, lots of smaller markets means you tend to have less competition between companies because they're each serving their own little patches and the like. And that was the point, actually, of the single market, was to say, let's try and make out of the European Union something closer to the single market of the United States. But actually, I think the US has, as the big dominant global economy, has managed to make itself the default platform for dynamic young companies to get off the ground. And in the same way that Hollywood is a very good place to go if you want to make a film, Silicon Valley is a very good place to go if you're in the business of creating new companies. And I think that is a dynamism which Europe will struggle to dislodge the US. I mean, there's a dynamism there, but there's an entrenched kind of advantage of incumbency. Silicon Valley is there. You don't need another one. Companies will go there. That will entrench Silicon Valley further. So I do feel the one thing that the Europeans will always find it hard to dislodge is US as a place where companies go to grow.
There's almost a cultural thing there with the United States, isn't there, about innovation as well, which is this sort of, I don't know, excitement of creating something.
Yeah, and a willingness to fail and to try stuff and to fail. Right. But the Europeans have decided, and again, it's worth Europe and the US each challenging their own models. The Europeans have decided to go for more social protection, more equality. The Europeans, if you look at the ratio of the top 10% to the bottom 10%, the US is an outlier. The Europeans are much more equal. I mean, they're not equal, but they're much more equal than the United States. These are all things that countries have chosen to do. The Europeans spend a lot more than twice as much as the US on non-pension social security. So put aside the pensions and the healthcare, the Europeans spend a lot more on benefits for working age adults than does the United States. So in all these areas, equality, social protection, all these areas, you see, the Europeans have made choices to work a little bit less, put a little bit more into the social side of stuff, and the US's emphasis has been on the more dynamic economy. And given its entrenched size and all of that, it is the place where companies go. Let's focus on one thing, which I think we do have data on, which is fertility rates or birth rates, which are how much are the people living in this country, who are citizens or residents of each of these countries, how much are they reproducing and keeping the population, if you like, young enough to sustain the old and to keep things dynamic. And to be honest, the US has a higher fertility rate than the Europeans. They're at 1.84. You know, the average of my four big European nations is 1.6. So they are reproducing more quickly than the Europeans. And I think a lot of Americans, and I think a lot on the right, would take that as a very positive sign. But to be absolutely honest, 1.8, 1.6, these are all quite low numbers. Everybody would, I think, say you face a challenge with that if that's your issue.
On the military, this document says it is far from obvious whether certain European countries will have economies and militaries strong enough to remain reliable allies. Do we have any evidence on that?
Well, look, what we do have is the spending figures, and these are always measured in percent of GDP. And the Europeans, you know, in the sort of latest full years, are only around 2.5%. So, I mean, they're all saying they're going to raise it. They're all around 2%. The Americans are north of 3%. So there's been a big difference. But, Sarah, and this is really important, measuring it by percent of GDP doesn't take into account the fact that the Americans do have a bigger GDP. So theirs is 3.2% of a bigger number than our 2%, you know, is of. And not only that, but I think a lot of people would argue when you look at the European spending on the military, it's not as efficient as the American spending because it's lots of different jurisdictions with their own little armies and their own equipment budgets and their own ways of doing stuff and procuring. And the Americans get more bang for their buck. So not only is it more percentage of GDP, they've got a bigger GDP and they get more bang for their buck, and that's why they are so much more military powerful.
And it must be worth actually giving the figures. The United States, in 2024, in billions of US dollars, spent 997 billion, whereas Germany, 88 billion, UK, 81 billion.
Yeah, so we're all, I mean...
We're just tiddlers.
We're small in that. But what I think you're hearing is, we're not really telling the listeners anything they didn't know. The Americans are a big military power and a stronger economy, and the Europeans are more into the sort of social stuff and equality. And that is, it's very interesting to me that, you know, the data does bear out these kinds of these things. But it's just whether you want to call that decaying Europe. And you can sort of see maybe the Europeans overdo it. You can have an argument about do they overdo it with the social protection and the working hours directives and 35-hour week in France and the like. Does Europe go too far? You can argue that. But you can also argue, do the Americans not get how to have a good life? You know, do they not get how to work less and enjoy themselves?
Okay, and well, that, you know, can we mention food here?
You can mention food.
Well, it's just...
I would rather the European food, personally.
Well, so, I mean, that might be because we've been brought up on it. I mean, if you were brought up on an American... Well, although arguably hamburgers originally, presumably, from Germany. You might think, what, that European rubbish?
Yeah, I mean, American food seems to have too much corn syrup in, and I can't put my finger on why, but yeah. When I go there, I always feel hungry, however big the portions are, because the food makes you hungry. But I prefer the European food. But look, we should talk about life expectancy, because this is a really interesting one. American life expectancy, despite the fact they spend so much more on healthcare, American life expectancy is actually lower than either Italy, France, Germany, or the UK. And you have to wonder, what is going wrong there? And that might be down to... They're working too hard. The food perhaps not. But there is something interesting, I think, about that, which was why I do think the Europeans need to kick the tires on their social models and say, are we sure we're doing it right? But that you can put that question back to the Americans and say, are you doing it? There was a book by a guy called Edward Luttwak, called Turbo Capitalism. This is years ago. And he said, turbocharged capitalism is making Americans fat. And there's some connection there. However, and at some point we must make a note to talk about happiness at more length. The US is not unhappy. I mean, they're not unhappy, and nor are the Europeans.
Right.
I think on average, the Americans are very slightly happier than the Europeans.
Okay, so
however, some
hold
of
on
the
one second. Different stats. It depends on which nation in Europe, doesn't it? Because as I understand it, Europe dominate the top 10 world
Correct.
happiness report.
Scandinavia is always at very high,
And that's down to Gallup.
Yeah.
USA are 25th.
Right. And if you take my four,
24th.
If you take my big four, the US, I think, lies below UK and Germany and above France and Italy. So it's not. We're all in the same ballpark when it comes to happiness. So let's not be.
Let's work less, eat European food, and be happy.